as I tried to say with a little bit of levity a few moments ago, we find ourselves in perilous and precarious times. And if you are like me, you have tried to come up with some coping mechanisms to not be fully consumed by the swirl of events unfolding yet coming that surround us. I was going to say on a daily basis, but really on a moment-by-moment basis. And I think we are called to some real reflection of how to navigate these kinds of seasons. And as I said a minute ago, David wrote this psalm partly because he was fleeing, listen to this now, he was fleeing from King Saul, a self-absorbed, narcissistic, cruel-intentioned leader. And he found himself in the midst of the camp of Abimelech, who also doesn't register high on the charitable heart scale. And Abimelech saw that David was in his midst and got a sense of who David was and was going to do David in. But David, because of the calamity and the peril of this situation, had to figure out how to strategize in this moment. So the historical understanding is that David, and the classical, if you will, traditional language around this is that David feigned madness. That he wanted Abimelech to think that he was so off kilter that he was not worth his time in terms of doing him in. So David was trying to figure out, and he did in the course of this psalm, how it is that he could display something that would confound Abimelech. That's when he devised this interesting remedy, if you will, to the situation. By saying that what Abimelech saw, when Abimelech looked at David, here's what he saw, here's what he heard and witnessed as David was in his midst. David simply saying, I will bless the Lord at all times, and his praise shall continually be in my mouth. And I suppose the strategy that he was using in the midst of Abimelech was that somehow that the king, Abimelech, would think, well, this man must be off kilter if all he can do is talk about praising God. If all he can do is talk about being joyous in the midst of God's presence. What kind of strategist is that? What kind of leader is that? Who all he's able to do is just talk about the overwhelming joy that he has by being in God's presence. And if that weren't enough, he goes on, David says, my soul shall make its boast in the Lord, and the humble shall hear thereof and be glad. Maybe he looked over at Abimelech and said, oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. Well, I hope you see what I saw when I was reading this with the understanding of what David was doing. He was making it clear that the intentional praise of God, and when I say praise of God, I don't mean by that performative and empty actions. When I say praising God, I'm talking about being cognizant of the presence and the power of God in our midst, giving God the honor that God and God alone is due. When we do that, God abides in our circumstance and strengthens us in the midst of our circumstance. And what David is bearing witness to here is that praising God, and by praising God, I mean an active, not a passive praising of God. A praising of God that calls us to work, a praising of God that calls us to bearing witness in the world. Praising God in and of itself is an act of resistance. You don't believe me? Flip the pages back and ask some of my forebears what the spirituals that were sung in seasons of travail and torment and even torture. What they did, no, they didn't resolve the situation. No, they didn't change legislation. No, they didn't cause people in Washington to all of a sudden become benevolent. But what they did do is strengthen those who were in the midst of travail to know that they were not alone. Let me just simplify it for you like this. What we see, what we hear, what we witness swirling around us right now, whether you watch it and see it on CNN or whether you see it in the reality of hatefulness that envelops you, understand that God's promise is to not forsake us, to not leave us, not abandon us, and that is worthy of praise because it encourages us in those moments to remind ourselves that we are not alone. And listen to me closely. I'm not saying that the praising of God simply represents an instantaneous cure to the maladies that surround us. I wish it did. No, but it gives us the sense of depth in our spirits to navigate through turbulent seas and difficult moments. I will bless the Lord at all times. I'll bless the Lord when I see cruelty and venality being displayed by those in leadership, because I know that wickedness a while may reign and Satan's power may seem to gain, but there is a God who does indeed rule above with a hand of power and a heart of love. And that's what will encourage me to stay the course, even in adverse seasons. So the remedy for the moment we find ourselves in, and when I say the remedy, I don't mean that I wish I could mean that it's going to solve everything instantaneously. No, the remedy for our own self-preservation is to know that we are not here by ourselves. We are not here by ourselves in largest measure because of God's presence, but we are not here by ourselves because we envelop one another in the bonds of love and common purpose and common openness of heart. You are your best remedy to the cruelty and unceasing, unwavering inhumanity that seems to swirl around us so much. So, praise is a prescriptive. Praise is an active measure of resistance. And when I say praise, I mean those things that call us to a cognizant, conscious awareness that God is in our midst. Praise in and out of season. Praise when things are good. Yes, that's easy. But praise also in the midnight hours that seem to envelop us so fully. So, maybe that's the remedy for the immediacy of the moment that we find ourselves in. And I'll just do this real quickly. I'll just say this. Pardon well, it's not crass or crude, but the basicness of this. I'm not going to let anyone else, except for the Lord, own any part of my heart, my mind, or my spirit. I'm not going to let anybody else barge into my being with their ugliness, with their selfishness, with all of those things that indeed can turn our hearts inside out. I'm not going to let them have the last word, because I know a God who sustains us in moments like that. And the record is clear that our trust and faith will be met by the faithfulness and trustworthiness of God. So, if that's the remedy, what does it look like to be safe in that context? and it's interesting because David goes on and he says, the angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him and delivereth them. Now, of course, we understand when that word fear, we need to sort of translate it into a context that we can understand. It doesn't mean to be afraid of. It means to stand in awe of the full totality of God. That's what's being said here. The angel of the Lord encampeth around them that fear him and delivereth them. So our refuge, our abiding comfort is in the strength of God. But listen to this. Our refuge and abiding comfort is in the strength of God, not because the fact that God is powerful, yes, and indeed God is all-knowing, yes. But I love it when it says, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good, and blessed is the one that trusteth in him." You know what and I won't use the word I don't like to use, I'll say this. You know what our secret implement in this struggle is? I don't want to call it the W word. Our secret implement, if you will, is not meeting harshness with harshness, is not meeting a stiff upper lip with a stiffer upper lip. Our power and our potency in all of this is that element of God that I think so often gets lost in the shuffle, if you will. People like to talk about the strength of God and the demanding, judgmental nature of God and all those things that they devise to try to anthropomorphize God, to make God seem a lot like us. No. The thing that makes God so powerful and potent in this kind of season is what the psalmist is talking about here. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Goodness and mercy. That's the powerful, potent element of God's presence in this world right now. Oh, we know that God is strong, yes. We know that God is wise, yes. But the dimension that we ought to exercise, the dimension that we ought to multiply by our actions is the goodness of God. How can we, first and foremost, be good to one another? How can we make sure that we sustain each other in the care of hearts and spirits? How can we make sure that if somebody has heard a harsh word out there, that they hear a good word in here? How can we make sure that we surround each other with the nature of God's goodness? Because that, to me, is the element of God that is most accessible. Can I be as wise as God? No. Can I be as powerful as God? No. But can I reflect a goodness that reflects the presence of God in my life and share that outwardly, fully and freely? Yes. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. So if you will, our refuge, our place of shelter is in the goodness of God. Do that daily. Do that minute by minute. Be good in contrast to what we see out here. I'm not on it nearly as much, I guess, as I used to be, and I say that sort of in a sense of thankfulness. I'm not on social media like I used to be, and the one platform, that our daughters used to tell my wife and I, Facebook is for old people. So I'm glad to report that I've retreated somewhat from that. But I will say this, it's fascinating. It's amazing to me how if somebody makes, and I really don't go back and forth with people, I really don't, but what I observe, and you'll see that if someone makes a comment of any sort, certainly, my goodness, if it's political or social or whatever, how quickly the hateful and vituperative and snarky responses come. It's almost as if people have a pent-up desire to just pounce on somebody, to make them make them maybe feel the way that they've been feeling because of the things that surround us. I'm not sure. But I'm saying that to say this, that because people are so quick to be able to do that, how much more powerful and potent it would be for us to make sure that what we embark, what we share and fully engage in is the goodness, the mercy, the loving kindness of God. That is potent. That is transformative. And then finally, let's approach this all with the strength and the strategy of praise. Let's abide in the goodness of God and model that in our lives. But then let God have God's way with us. What do I mean by that? The psalmist has said, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man that trusts in him. O fear the Lord, ye saints, for there is no want to them that fear him. The young lions do lack and suffer hunger, but they that seek the Lord shall not want any good thing. You know what's going on there? And maybe this is the rest part. You've heard in the previous weeks other ways to live out your presence in powerful and impactful ways, but maybe coming to a point of rest. Maybe the encouragement is that rest really means restoration. Not static and uneventful, but no, when I rest, as the 46th Psalm tells me to be still, and know that God is God, that the restoration of my spirit, the knitting back together of all that has been attacked and torn at because of the world we find ourselves in, is unfolding because we have a God who cares for us, who nurtures us, and we're called to trust in that moment, that season of rest. Don't be afraid. Listen, I'll be finished in a second here, but I just have to say this. I don't know how many of you are captains of industry and et cetera, but don't be offended. I have my theory, because several of those captains of industries for the last numbers of months have been talking about the return to work mandate, and it's so important to be back in the office, and therefore that's the only way that one can be productive. And you know what? Maybe on some level there might be something to that, but I don't think that's what's motivating them. I think what's motivating them is they find validity, listen to me, they find validity in being consumed by an activity that points toward material gain. So whether they feel that their employees being in the office helps them to succeed more, or whether they think that that's what validates anyone else, maybe that's the case. But here's what I'm saying to you. You can't be defined by what you do. You have to be defined by who you are. And if you're defined by who you are, then what you do is a reflection of what God has shaped you and formed you into being. So understand that, sure, we're called to, the Bible even says, I must work, for the hour cometh when no one can work. But I feel as well that we need to understand not to be afraid of rest, not to be afraid of those moments of indeed restoration, not to be afraid of those moments of being still and letting God be in our midst and working with us. Society might try to look askance at being still, but indeed we're called to let God have God's way with us in those moments of restoration, of renewal, that the very nature of our soul and spirit is reshaped and refashioned because we let God work with us in those moments of rest. So, we've got our work in front of us, yes. We have to figure out how to meet the incivility, the harshness, the brutality of what we see swirling around us right now. And how do we meet it? With a sense that we are preserved. We meet it with the power of praise. We meet it with acknowledging that God is in our midst, and that because of that, we are not consumed. And then we also find our strength and our shelter in the very God who makes certain that God's goodness is what empowers us. But then, when all that work is being done, remember, God also calls us to rest. God calls us to the wilderness. God calls us to the quiet places. God calls us to those times when we need to be still and hear God's voice. The remedy is our praise. The refuge is the goodness of God. And the rest is the restoration of God being at work in our hearts and our spirits. And the good news is this: other folk may be doing other things, but God is at work in our midst. And the last time I checked, God is not through with us yet. Amen.